This isn't just a seal pressed into warm wax, it's a surrender. A quiet, bureaucratic capitulation that echoed louder than any cannon's roar. A sound absorbed not by the air, but by the ledgers of history. The weapon wasn't a bullet, but a bond. A piece of paper with more destructive power than an artillery shell. Its yield measured not in shrapnel, but in compound interest. The battlefield wasn't a desert of sand and rock, but a ledger of vellum and ink. A landscape of columns and balances, of promissory notes and repayment schedules that stretched into a bleak and inescapable horizon. And the empire that fell, that great and ancient edifice of sultans and caliphs, never saw its conqueror coming until the chains of obligation were already locked tight, link by financial link, each one forged in the counting houses of a distant capital. Our story begins in Constantinople, in the year 1853. The air over the Bosphorus is thick with the scent of jasmine and decay, of salt spray and stagnation. The Ottoman Empire, once the undisputed terror of Christendom, the formidable seat of an Islamic caliphate stretching from the gates of Vienna to the Persian Gulf, is now gasping for air. A beached leviathan, its vast bulk still imposing but its vitality seeping away into the sands of a new century. In the gilded drawing rooms of Pera, European diplomats sip coffee and whisper a condescending clinical diagnosis, the sick man of Europe. But to focus only on the visible symptoms, the military defeats at the hands of Russia, the antiquated government structure, the restless nationalist stirrings in the Balkans, is to misdiagnose the patient entirely. Look closer, beneath the ceremonial silks and the fading grandeur of Topkapi Palace. The sickness isn't in the spirit of its people or the raw courage of its soldiers. It's in the treasury. It's a sickness of empty coffers, of a fiscal heart beating a frantic, weakening rhythm, starved of the oxygen of sound currency. It is a systemic failure of an ancient economic organism, confronting the ruthless, mechanized financial engines of the industrial West. The sultans of the 19th century, men like the reformist Abdul-Majid I and his successor Abdulaziz, saw the writing on the wall, etched there by the steam-powered ships that now dwarfed their wooden fleets. They dreamed of modernity, of rebuilding their sprawling multi-ethnic empire in the gleaming image of the West that had so decisively surpassed them. They envisioned steel arteries of railways stitching their disparate lands together, the instant, crackling whispers of telegraphs leaping across mountains, and modern armies, clad in crisp European-style uniforms and armed with the latest rifles, to stand as equals to those of Britain and France. But dreams of imperial renewal are devastatingly expensive, and the Ottoman economic engine, built on ancient systems of subsistence agriculture, feudal land tenure, and irregular tribute, produced tradition and stability, not the torrents of hard, liquid cash demanded by the contracts of locomotive manufacturers and Krupp artillery works. So, with a mix of genuine hope and profound desperation, they looked west, beyond the blue expanse of the Mediterranean, to the rising, pulsing financial power of the age, the city of London. British capital in the mid-19th century was a roaring, relentless river, swollen by the colossal profits of empire, the bounty of Indian opium and Caribbean sugar, and the explosive productivity of its Midlands factories. This river of money sought any channel, any outlet, where it could flow and multiply. It found a deep, inviting channel in the waters of the Bosphorus, a conduit to an empire desperate for liquidity. The first major loan arrived in 1854 during the crucible of the Crimean War, presented as a strategic lifeline from a powerful ally against the encroaching Russian bear. It was a transaction carefully wrapped in the language of geopolitical friendship and mutual interest. Then came another, and another, each deal signed with a diplomatic flourish accompanied by a reassuring smile and secured by an interest rate that quietly, inexorably mortgaged the empire's future. The initial relief in Istanbul was palpable and real. Here, at last, was the fuel for the great engine of reform. Steel could be ordered, experts hired, bureaucracies modernized. But the trap, the exquisite, devastating trap of sovereign debt, wasn't in the loan itself, but in its inexorable mathematical logic. It was a one-way door. The loans were issued in gold sterling or gold francs, the immutable hard currency of the emerging global financial system, its value as fixed as the sun. Yet the Ottoman state's tax revenue, collected from peasants in the Anatolian highlands, merchants in Damascus, and farmers in the Nile Delta, came in its own depreciating paper currency, the kaime. As the empire, caught in a vicious cycle, printed more and more of this paper money to cover its daily shortfalls and service its foreign obligations, the kaime plummeted in value. It was a catastrophic currency mismatch, a financial death spiral. Imagine trying to fill a hole dug by a steam shovel with a teaspoon made of melting ice. Every semi-annual coupon payment due to the bondholders in London required the Ottoman treasury to gather a veritable mountain of devalued paper, a Herculean task that grew more impossible, more soul-crushing. With each passing season, the empire was selling its substance to buy time, and time was becoming prohibitively expensive. The descent was not a matter of chance, but a mathematical certainty, a grim equation playing out in the ledgers. By 1875, the empire was spending a staggering 2/3 of its entire national revenue, just to service the interest on its colossal debt. Not to pay down the principal, not to build a single new school or bridge, just to keep the foreign creditors at bay for another year, to avoid the specter of a formal default. The actual state machinery, the soldiers who guarded the frontiers, the bureaucrats who collected taxes, the engineers who maintained the roads, had to run on the remaining pitiful third. The sublime Porte, the seat of imperial power, had effectively become a tenant in its own palace. Its grand policies and sovereign decisions dictated by the unforgiving calendar of quarterly payments due in a bank overseas. The Sultan's writ now ran only as far as his credit line, and what was the collateral for this spiraling? suffocating obligation, nothing less than the empire's very lifeblood, its most reliable and productive sources of income. In a series of increasingly humiliating agreements, the Ottoman crown, like a nobleman pawning his family jewels, pledged its crown revenues. The bustling customs revenues from the ports of Smyrna and Salonika, where the goods of 3 continents changed hands. The lucrative taxes on Anatolia's rich, aromatic tobacco and the silks of Bursa. The profitable salt and fishing monopolies. These weren't abstract numbers on a balance sheet. They were the empire's tangible wealth, the sinews of the state, now mortgaged to the hilt, pledged not to a neighboring monarch, but to a faceless committee that didn't sit in the halls of the Sublime Porte in Istanbul, but in a nondescript, gray-stone building on Cannon Street, in the very heart of London's financial district. This institutionalization of control was the birth of the OPDA, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. Established by the decree of Muharram in 1881, it was a state within a state, a financial shadow government run by and for the foreign bondholders from Britain, France, Germany, and later Italy. It employed over 5,000 officials, its own army of accountants, agents, and enforcers who marched not with rifles and bayonets, but with leather-bound ledger books and the authority of international finance into the heart of Ottoman cities. Their mandate was coldly efficient: to collect the pledge taxes directly, bypassing the Sultan's own officials entirely, ensuring the revenue stream flowed unimpeded back to European coffers. Consider the profound daily humiliation of this arrangement. A French financier sitting on the OPDA board in Istanbul could veto where a Turkish railway was built, his decision based solely on profit potential for debt repayment, not the strategic or economic needs of the empire. A British collector, armed with the full force of international treaty, took a direct cut of every fig, every rug, every bale of cotton sold in the bustling bazaars of Izmir. The Sultan's sovereignty, the very essence of independent statehood, was leaking away, not in a single dramatic battle lost on a field of honor, but in 1,000 daily transactions, in every customs house receipt stamped by a foreign agent. The empire was being quietly, systematically repossessed, its economic autonomy stripped away with the cold, impersonal efficiency of a bankruptcy court administering a failing estate. The OPDA's reports were more scrutinized in European capitals than the Sultan's firman. Then came the final, cataclysmic storm, the Great Unraveling, 1914. The Great War engulfed Europe in a firestorm of unprecedented scale. The Ottoman leadership, cornered, strategically isolated, and desperate to break the chains that bound it, saw a perilous opportunity in a secret alliance with Imperial Germany. It was a last, desperate gamble for survival, a bid to seize sovereignty through the crucible of war, and with the stroke of a pen they made their definitive, fateful move. They entered the global conflict, and with it, they declared all foreign economic controls, the entire OPDA apparatus, null and void. They repudiated the debt. For the young Turk triumvirate in the palace in Istanbul, it was an act of national survival, the tearing up of the financial shackles. For the bankers of London and Paris, for the thousands of middle-class European citizens who held Ottoman bonds as investments, it was an act of war as grave as any military attack. An assault on the very sanctity of capital, on the foundational belief that debt must always be honored. It confirmed their deepest prejudices about Oriental unreliability and cemented the Ottoman state as a pariah in the financial world, a status as damning as any military defeat. When the war ended in 1918 with the Ottomans' total, crushing defeat, that mountain of repudiated debt, though legally voided by the act of war, was not forgotten. It was, in fact, the first item on the victor's agenda, the ledger of grievances that demanded settlement. The Paris Peace Conference of 1919 was not just about redrawing maps and assigning blame for the bloodshed. It was, fundamentally, about settling accounts. The victors, their own treasuries drained by the war, didn't just want territorial compensation. They wanted their balance sheets made whole, their pre-war financial order restored, and their losses recouped. The language of finance and the language of geopolitics had become one. The 1920 Treaty of Sèvres, imposed upon the shattered empire, was more than a political dismantling. It was the final foreclosure notice, the liquidation of a bankrupt estate. The empire was to be dismembered, its parts sold off to satisfy its creditors. Its core, Anatolia, was shrunk to a rump state. Its oil-rich Arab lands, Mesopotamia, Palestine, Syria, were mandated to Britain and France, the very nations whose creditors it had owed. The financial claims of the pre-war era, the investments and bonds, were seamlessly, cynically transmuted into political control in the post-war world. The creditor became the ruler. The debt obligation became a mandate for colonization. The ledger had finally produced a map. So did Britain and France buy the Middle East? Not with a single signed check handed to a sultan, but with a far more sophisticated and binding instrument, a financial algorithm of debt, dependency, and enforcement so potent, so insidious, that it made traditional conquest look crude, expensive, and overt. They built an invisible cage of credit, its bars forged from trust and the promise of progress. When the empire, in its final, agonized death throes, finally rattled those bars with the violence of war, the cage itself collapsed upon it, and from the wreckage, the creditors extracted not just repayment, but the very blueprint for a new Middle East, drawn to suit their strategic and economic needs. The borders drawn in the 1920s, those arbitrary straight lines on maps that define Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon today, lines that cut across ancient communities and trade routes. They weren't just drawn by diplomats wielding rulers at a conference table in Versailles or Cairo. They were first traced, in ghostly but indelible outline, by the hand of accumulated debt, by the creditor's need to create manageable, revenue-producing units that could service loans, and by the strategic interests of creditor nations determined to protect their investments in railways, ports, and most importantly, oil. The modern Middle Eastern state system was born not only from the politics of ethnicity and the Sykes-Picot Agreement, but from the prior, deeper economics of insolvency. The political instability, the deep-seated pervasive sense of external manipulation that has plagued the region for a century. The legacy of foreign intervention. These aren't merely the legacies of war and colonialism in their classic form. They are, in no small part, the enduring legacy of compound interest, a force more patient and relentless than any army, a force that outlived the empire that incurred it and shaped the destinies of the states that emerged from its ashes. The debt was never just about money. It was about sovereignty. And when the debt was called, sovereignty was what was ultimately forfeit. We're taught history in the stark, declarative language of treaties and the thunderous, heroic narrative of battles. But sometimes the true story, the deeper, more persistent current shaping our collective destiny, is told in the quiet, precise, and unforgiving lines of a ledger. It's a sobering reminder that power in the modern world doesn't always wear a uniform or a crown. Sometimes it wears a banker's sober waistcoat, carries a leather-bound portfolio of bond certificates, and its most enduring conquests are not celebrated with parades, but filed in triplicate in a fireproof vault, accruing interest through the silent passage of years. The modern world we live in, with its intricate lines of economic influence and political dependency, its structural inequalities between nations, was purchased, loan by loan, default by default, in an era when finance became the ultimate weapon of empire, a weapon that could hollow out a state from within long before a single soldier crossed its border. And the debt, in one form or another, economic, political, psychological, is still being paid, its installments falling due in every crisis, every intervention, every whispered accusation of neocolonialism. The seal in the wax was broken, but the impression it left on the page of history is permanent. This has been Dominion Archives. If you believe the past is the key to understanding our present, then subscribe, because the history you know, the story of kings and congresses, of speeches and sieges, is only half the story. The other half, the silent, decisive half that moves in the shadows behind the throne and the parliament, is in the account books, in the flow of capital and the tyranny of debt, waiting, always waiting, for its interest to come due.